Hello all and welcome to Conversations on Leadership, a podcast by Academy Wales. Our guest for this episode is Liz Lalley. Liz, welcome.
Hello.
So before we kick off, I think it would be really nice for our listeners just to get a little bit of background on yourself, if that's okay.
Sure. So I am currently the Director of Economic Strategy and Policy in Welsh Government. I have been in Welsh Government since 2018. My civil service career is now about 23 years. But prior to that, I worked in the private sector for a little while. So I started as a civil servant in London, working for what was then the DTI, and then transferred home to Wales, spent 10 years in Companies House before coming to Welsh Government.
What would you say is your greatest strength?
I think I would say empathy. So I believe I have quite a high dose of empathy, and it really matters to me engaging with people in a way that makes them feel comfortable and candid. And I like to understand how it feels to be someone else when facing things, because I think it's a useful skill to get through life.
What job other than your own would you like to attempt?
If I had been any good at science, which I wasn't, I would have loved to have been a vet. And I think that still holds. I know some vets now, and I actually think it's quite a difficult life in many ways, but I would nevertheless thoroughly enjoy the challenges and the positives that that sort of job would bring.
How do you successfully lead when transitioning across such different policy areas? And what skills have you found to be transferable?
For me, I think it remains always about the people. So if you've got people skills, they are the ones that are transferable, I think. So leadership for me isn't about being a subject matter expert. It's not about being the person in the room who knows the most. It's about being the person in the room who can lead people, understand the systems that they're operating within, make decisions, reach consensus if possible, bring people together. So that is the consistent for me. Now, that's not to say that you don't operate in different leadership modes, if you like. So during COVID, for example, I was much more directive than I think I've ever been previously, because it was such a febrile environment and there was so much uncertainty that actually just being a bit more directive about some steps that need to be taken were right in the moment, because people needed an environment in which they could feel confident and comfortable to act. Whereas in the economic policy world, we don't have that urgency and that pressure, and it's much more about engaging with people across the system, understanding the kind of the issues and working in collaboration to work out what a sensible approach would be to end up with a policy solution. So I think you operate in different modes, but for me, the consistency is always understanding the people that you're working with, leading them, bringing that empathy that I spoke about at the beginning. I think that's really important in a leadership role.
So when you talk about people skills, again, it's something that comes up quite often in these streams. I'm quite interested, how much of that is a natural skill and how much is a learned ability?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I suspect my empathy streak is probably a natural thing, but that is not to say that you can't learn people skills as well.
Yeah.
So, and empathy, it being natural, probably only takes you so far, and that as a leader, you've got to learn how you apply that, if you like. So what is it telling you, and what does that mean in terms of your next actions? So I absolutely do not buy into this belief that existed probably in the early days of my career, that managers are made and leaders are born. I don't believe in that. I believe you absolutely can train yourself to be a leader, and the people skills are as part of that as well.
I know that you've had key leadership roles through quite a lot of kind of challenging periods for the country. Look at that COVID response. Before that, then Brexit Preparedness, another one. How did those experiences kind of teach you about leading teams through uncertainty and dealing with fast changing environments?
So I might start with COVID, because that was probably the steepest learning curve.
Right.
And I think the reason for that is just a degree of uncertainty that wasn't in the office and then you went home to your everyday life. People were working on this and going home to similar levels and when we were in the office before we went into lockdown. But you couldn't switch off from it. So people were trying to get the head around it in the work time, if you like, trying to bring some degree of order and to understand how we respond. And for many people that I was working with, it was more life and death than any other policy job that they would ever work on. And then they would switch off the laptop or go home, depending what time in the response we were, and they'd be dealing with family members who were, I don't know, homeschooling, their elderly parents who were at heightened risk. It was just everywhere. There was no switching off from it. And I was incredibly conscious of the pressure that put people under. So, there were various tools and techniques, complicated slightly, I think, by the fact that we were all adjusting to working online. So, if I had a door, I'd describe my leadership style as open door policy, but obviously I don't have a door. But what I mean is people can come and talk to me at any point. I would much rather create an environment where people can come and tell me how they're feeling, if things are going wrong in a work sense. People call it psychological safety now, don't they? It's creating that environment. It was a different way of doing it online. So quite often we'd kind of set up structures that were just a safe space for people to just give a bit of a download, half an hour once a week. But also I still don't know the etiquette of this, but I would often just call people up if I got a sense that things were a bit difficult, and just give them a Teams call and see how they were doing. So there's that sort of human touch to the leadership in that sort of environment. But also, and I think the difficult thing in a leadership sense in that set of circumstances was how much we didn't know, and how much we didn't know what the end looked like, or how we came out of it, or when that would be, and trying to do the job of coordinating the response in that level of uncertainty is really difficult for people. And all I could do was own that and be really clear that none of us really could see what how we were getting out of this at the early days, what the end looked like, but we could give them the next steps. So I think people really sometimes just need a sense of direction to come from somebody. But that's just like, as I say, that's much more directive than I've ever been. But it was helping people put one foot in front of the other, to give them a sort of sense they were helping, that they were achieving things, that they were making a difference, and also to bring almost a degree of comfort in that incredibly difficult time.
What does resilience mean to you, and how can other leaders build resilience into an organization or a team or a community?
In a leadership context, specifically, like ignoring your sort of what you're working on at the time, I think resilience, I can tell you what it's not hero leadership. It's not always standing in the front and doing everything. There is a degree of shielding people around you, but it's not at your own expense. So part of resilience, I think, is recognizing what you need to do in order to keep yourself going through challenging circumstances. And that applies to the whole team. So I have got a very basic recipe for my own resilience, which is I need to get outside and see the outside world, and I need to go for a walk. It's not groundbreaking, is it? But it works for me. But I will say to my team all the time, whatever, they need to find what it is that works for them, that keeps them resilient. And it can be different for different things. Some people like to go to the gym. Some people like to read a book. Whatever it is, find your trick and hang on to it. Because I think a leader who works themselves into the ground and is exhausted is not a useful leader.
You were heavily involved in the coordination, the organisation of the state funeral for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, which you were awarded an MBE for. Congratulations.
Thank you.
How did that experience influence your approach to leading during high-pressure national moments?
Yeah, so I should say it's only... it was the Wales element, so I can't take the credit for all of the amazing things that happened in London. So the main thing for me with that was recognizing the whole system and every partner involved in it was needed to make it work effectively. So the bringing together of people was just critical, and actually having agreed set of objectives that you're all working towards was really important. And again, I know that sounds quite basic, but actually when you're working on something that's that time pressured, and we had quite a lot to do in a short period of time with no leeway, getting the right people together really quickly, agreeing what we would be doing, what we were working towards, the parameters within which we were doing it and how we were going to keep communicating was absolutely crucial. And there's quite a lot of problem solving in this stuff as well, isn't there? Issues emerge, but if you've got those relationships and the governance right at the beginning, that problem solving is a lot easier, because you've got all the expertise that you need to draw on, and you've got all the structures in place that allow you to make that decision and communicate it through so everyone knows. So that would be my massive takeaway, was it was a whole team effort, and we couldn't have done it without them.
What leadership mindsets do you think are essential for balancing the short-term pressures with those long-term sustainable economic goals?
I think that is a really important question that everybody needs to think about, because, particularly in a tight fiscal position, there's always a kind of pressure on the immediate. And it's quite right that we should look at some immediate things. But I think you've always got to have that look in the trajectory of the longer term. Like, what are we working towards? And how does what we're doing now contribute towards it? We're very lucky in Wales because we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which gives us that framework within which to think ahead, think about the consequences that we are creating in the moment. So actually using that framework has seen me through a little bit. There's something about learning lessons, which actually I think applies to your question previously about resilience. Okay. These things are not once and done. There's always an opportunity to take stock, review. I work in the policy profession. We talk about going through the policy cycle. That doesn't have to begin and end with a beginning and ending of a policy. So you can keep reviewing this stuff. And I think just taking a moment to look at what you're doing, learn the lessons of what's gone before you, think about how that's mapping out onto your longer term aim is quite important. It's quite easy to not do that when you're under pressure, and the kind of the busyness of the day to day can stop you, but actually carving out the time to do that is really important, because as you say, this is, especially in the economy space, this is a long-term thing. It doesn't shift very quickly. So always making sure you're working towards that end game is really important.
And looking at the longer term focus, are there any particular specific challenges that we need to highlight or be aware of here?
We talk about permacrisis, don't we? And shock after shock after shock. Well, I suspect that's just life now. Like the external environment is just changing, and it doesn't have to be a crisis, but the advancement of technology, the changing geopolitical situation, we are just living in now a very rapidly evolving world. And it is quite a leadership challenge, I think, to provide direction through that. So when I started out in the civil service, making policy felt like something you could do in a relatively benign sense, if you like, in that, you could take 2 years to develop a policy and some legislation through to implementation. You were pretty sure the world was going to look like it did when you started, when you put it into practice. I think those days are gone forever. So it's now, I think there's something about the leadership adjusting how it thinks about leadership. And it's much more, I think, now about frameworks and toolkits and sort of smaller objectives in order to chart a course through that ever-changing environment.
So if we think about this ever-changing world that we're currently inhabiting, then if there was one piece of advice that you could give to someone starting a leadership journey, if you like, someone just coming up, what would that be?
Oh, one piece. So I think any leader needs to have a solid support network. I'll call it that. So don't try and go it alone. It's far too difficult. It's far too complicated. Don't feel isolated in a leadership role. People often have this kind of, I'm the leader, I'm going to take it all onto my shoulders. I have to be responsible for everything. I will save the day. I'll be the umbrella that protects the team and the net at the bottom that scoops up things that perhaps have been missed. I just don't think that you can operate like that. And I think one of the best ways to challenge yourself is to have a mentor or to have a coach or to have a really good support network. However, whatever that looks like for you, is to have those people that you can draw on that just give you a little check and balance about how you are and how you are operating, and are you doing the thing that only you can do.
I think time has beaten us again, so I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you so much, Liz, for joining us. I think that's been great. I know our listeners will really appreciate it, and I really hope you've enjoyed the experience.
I have. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
Mae un podlediad Sgwrsiau ar Arweinyddiaeth ar gael trwy ein gwefan. Mae'r hawlfraint y podlediad yma yn cael ei gadw gan Llywodraeth Cymru. Our Conversations on Leadership podcast is available through our website. Copyright of this podcast is held by the Welsh Government.